So with the virus situation in France, it looks like I might not be able to make it down to the Beaujolais this year. So instead, I've decided to make this video opening up 3 2018 Beaujolais from my cellar. 2018 is a vintage, in fact, that's going to be on the market a while longer. Very large crop. So large, in fact, that producers are not going to bottle their 2019s until a bit later in many cases. In fact, they may not be able to bottle them with the difficulties that France is having right now. And in fact, 2 of these wines, I bought them, but I haven't even tasted them yet. So I have a Fleury from Yvan Maitras. I have a Morgon Côte de Pie from Foillard, and I have the old vine bottling of the Morgon Délice from Daniel Bouland from vines planted in 1926. 3 quite different wines, Maitras and Foillard, both in the more nature school of Beaujolais, whereas Bouland is pretty conventional farming, let's say, certainly not organic, but diligent farming, serious farming and very old vines, semi-carbonic maceration rather than carbonic maceration for these 2. So he does 2 pump overs a day during about a 2-week vinification. 2018 was a huge bumper crop in the Beaujolais. I mean, really a very large crop. And that in some ways saved the vintage. We're not used to talking about high yields being a good thing in wine, but in the really warm conditions of 2018, combined with a lot of winter rain, which meant that the vines didn't suffer as much as you might have imagined they would, meant that the grapes, because there were so many of them, didn't ripen as fast as they otherwise would have done. And so I went to the Beaujolais to taste these wines last year, kind of expecting them to be very blousy and overripe. And there are definitely some super ripe wines, some very record high alcohols. But it was less extreme than I expected. And I think, as in the Côte d'Or, the higher than average yields buffered ripening, slowed it down, and meant producers were able to pick in a timely fashion. Of course, producers in the Beaujolais are also getting much more habituated to these warm, ripe vintages, so they also know better what they're doing. Anyway, it's definitely a sun-kissed vintage, and I think if it has a defect, it's that the wines are just a bit too fruit-driven and simple. I mean, if you think of Gamay as a bit of a chameleon grape that can sometimes be a bit more reminiscent of Grenache and sometimes be a bit more reminiscent of Pinot Noir, it's the cooler vintages that are a bit more inclined towards the style of Pinot Noir, especially when they have a bit of age, they can be mistaken for Burgundies, and those are the vintages I personally gravitate towards for my own cellar. So this is the first time I'm trying the 2018 Maitras Fleury. I bought a case and I think some magnums of this, and it came direct from Beaujolais to my cellar here, so I tend to have good experiences. Sometimes the wines can travel in a slightly erratic way, given the very low sulfur, or no sulfur often. But it's showing beautifully, quite a delicate bouquet, but a bit more floral and high-toned, ethereal than the 2017 was. It's also a bit more delicate structurally. Not just concentrated either, but beautifully balanced, fresh, lively. The alcohol must be pretty modest, I'm guessing. It says 13 on the label. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a little less than that even analytically. So next to that, I have the Foillard Côte de Pie, one of the emblematic wines of Beaujolais. Jean Foillard was inspired by his neighbor, Marcel Lapierre, to start vinifying his wines without sulfur. I think in the mid-80s was really when he started getting going. I think he talks about 85 as being the first vintage that they made that wasn't a train wreck. He's very diligent about making pure, clean wines. Actually, he doesn't have much time for some elements of the natural wine movement who are more, inclined to take faults as proof of authenticity. This is already aromatically deeper pitched, what you'd expect from Morgon, Plamier. Sort of a bit like a cross between the 16 and the 17. It isn't quite as overtly ripe and sweet as the 17, but nor does it have the real high-toned, perfumed Burgundian qualities of the 16, which I absolutely loved. For me, the 16 is my favorite recent vintage of Foillard, despite the fact that the vineyard was hailed. I don't know how they achieved that result. And then the Boulan says subscriber actually was saying that they'd had this bottling recently and they found it too ripe, too jammy. I loved it from back a year ago when I tried it at the winery, and so far it smells pretty promising. But one thing is to note is that Boulogne for the first time made two cuvées of Delices. It's this little vineyard just around the back of where he built his new house. Quite steep, decomposed granite quartz, very old vines, 1926 planting. And he made the cuvée, it's this one that I threw in my cellar, the 1926 vines, which is always almost like a young cornas. It's one of the most muscular, powerful, structured wines produced in the Beaujolais, and in as I said before, semi-carbonic maceration, the traditional vinification with stems, whole bunches, but also pump overs, not strict carbonic maceration like these two. But he also bottled a young vine cuvée of Delices, which just, the old wine version says Vin de 1926 on the label. So. That definitely has the most body, mid-palate volume of the three, but I don't find any overt characteristics. I don't find any overt sucrosity of fruit even. To me, in fact, it's calmed down a bit since I tried it a year ago. For me, that's very promising. On all three of these wines are very much kind of what I expected from the 2018 vintage. So you never know when you revisit a year later wines you've tasted quite what's going to happen, especially in case of lower sulfur wines. But I think it's a nicely balanced, charming, easy, pleasurable vintage in the Beaujolais. Some people have claimed, especially at harvest time, people were saying this is the vintage of the century for Beaujolais. That's clearly not the case, unless you don't like Beaujolais. Because these wines, as a whole, it's a vintage that, I mentioned the chameleon character of Gamay. It's a vintage that has a little bit more Grenache in it than Pinot Noir, in the sense of that there's two polarities to which Gamay can incline depending on the weather. It's just sun-kissed, very fruit-forward, friendly vintage. I think it'll make a lot of new admirers for the region as a whole. Whether it will absolutely delight and thrill people who adore the sort of striking sort of vibrant crushed berry flowers, violets, perfume qualities that cooler vintages in the Beaujolais could deliver. I don't know. I bought a few for my cellar. I'm happy to have bought a few cases, and I'll probably leave it at that.